It was past midnight in the Baltic when the first metallic bang echoed through the bow of the MS Estonia. Most of her 989 passengers were asleep. The ferry was 14 years old, a familiar workhorse on the overnight crossing between Tallinn and Stockholm, and the autumn storm outside was nothing the Baltic had not thrown at her before. But the locks, holding her 65-ton bow Visor to the ship, had been quietly failing for years. Cracks had spread through 90% of the welds. The stempost was split into 4 pieces, and 20 months earlier, her near sister had suffered the same failure on the same sea, and no one had told the Estonia's crew. In less than an hour, 852 people would be dead. The warning had already been given. It had simply never arrived. If you are drawn to the great ships and the disasters that claimed them, subscribe and stay to the end. Because the flaw that killed the Estonia was not a sudden break. It was something far worse. Chapter 1. A ferry built for the Baltic. She was born as the Viking Sally, built by Meyer Werft of Papenburg in 1980 for the busy Baltic ferry routes between Scandinavia and Finland. She was a product of a golden age in Baltic shipping, an era when the ferries grew larger, faster, and more ambitious with every new commission, and when the roll-on, roll-off concept was transforming the economics of the sea. The yards in Germany, Finland, and Sweden were launching ships at a pace that matched the demand, each one longer and wider and more heavily laden than the last, because the money was extraordinary and the sea was forgiving and the passengers kept coming. The yard laid her keel on the 18th of October, 1979. She was launched on the 26th of April, 1980, and completed the following day. The original design called for a vessel of 137 meters, but during construction, the plans were stretched, the hull lengthened, the superstructure redesigned to hold more passengers, more cabins, more revenue. By the time she slid into the water, she was 155 meters long and 24 meters wide, with a draft of 5 meters 60 and a gross tonnage of 15,566. She had 9 decks stacked above the waterline and the blunt, functional profile of every Baltic ferry of her generation. 4 MON diesel engines, each driving its own shaft, produced a combined 17,625 kilowatts of power, enough to push her through the Baltic at 21 knots in the kind of weather that the sea threw at her most nights between October and April. Her passenger capacity was 2,000. Her cabins could berth 1,190. Her 2 car decks could carry 460 vehicles, loaded through the bow and the stern, driven aboard by their owners and parked in rows on the open steel deck that ran the full length of the ship below the passenger accommodation. Over the years, as she was modified and refitted, her gross tonnage would be registered at 21,794. The accumulated weight of a ship that had been stretched and altered and added to by successive owners who wanted more from her than the original plans had drawn. She was not glamorous. She was not famous. She was a ferry, built to a budget, built to work, and for a decade she did exactly that, carrying the traffic of the Baltic back and forth on schedule with the mechanical reliability that her German builders had engineered into her. Her power, 23,636 horsepower pushing through the water, was the steady, unglamorous force of a ship designed to arrive on time rather than to impress. She was renamed twice in 3 years, Silja Star in 1990 and Wasa King in 1991, passed between operators like a working animal between owners, each one putting her to the same use on the same sea. Those car decks were the point of her. The roll-on, roll-off ferry was the machine that had turned Baltic crossings from something passengers endured into something they chose. You drove your car aboard through the bow, parked on the open vehicle deck, walked upstairs to your cabin or the bar, ate dinner, drank tax-free spirits, slept through the crossing, and drove off the other end in the morning. No cranes, no cargo nets, no waiting on the quayside while stevedores lowered your car into a hold. The ferries were floating hotels with a car park underneath, and they were enormously profitable. By the late 1980s, the Baltic ferry industry was one of the largest passenger shipping markets in the world, and the ships were growing to meet it. The duty-free trade alone generated fortunes. The bars and restaurants turned the crossing into a destination in itself, and the car decks beneath them hummed with the engines of lorries and private cars that represented the commerce of an entire region. But the design that made the concept work carried a vulnerability that the industry understood and chose to live with. The car deck ran the full length of the ship, open and unpartitioned, a single vast space, roughly the size of a football pitch. There were no watertight bulkheads dividing it. There were no barriers to stop water, once it entered, from moving freely across the full beam of the vessel. If water entered that deck in quantity, it would slosh with the ship's motion, surging from one side to the other, creating what naval architects call a free surface effect. The weight of the water would amplify any roll. A list would deepen itself. And a row-row ferry with a flooded car deck could capsize with a speed that left almost no time for evacuation. The Herald of Free Enterprise had proved this in the most brutal terms 7 years earlier. On the 6th of March, 1987, she had sailed from Zeebrugge with her bow doors open. Water had flooded her car deck. She had capsized. 193 people had died. The industry had reacted with new rules, new bridge indicators, new vigilance about the state of the bow doors. But the fundamental design had not changed. The open car deck stayed. The bow loading arrangement stayed. And on every row-row ferry in the Baltic, the only thing standing between the sea and that vast, unpartitioned space was the bow door system. On the Viking Sally, that system was a bow visor. Chapter 2. The Visor and the Assumption. The bow visor was the largest single moving part on the vessel, a massive clamshell of steel plating that formed the ship's blunt, enclosed bow profile when lowered and swung upward on 2 hinge arms when the ship was in port to expose the car loading ramp behind it. When salvaged from the seabed after the disaster and weighed, it came to 65.5 tons, substantially heavier than its original design weight of approximately 55 tons. The difference accumulated over 14 years of repairs, modifications, and the slow layering of marine coatings on steel that spent its working life in the salt spray of the Baltic. It weighed more than a fully loaded articulated lorry, and it was held to the ship by 3 hydraulic locks and 2 hinges. The visor was a substantial piece of marine engineering, designed to look and feel like part of the ship when closed. In port, the sight of the visor rising was a spectacle of industrial scale. 65 tons of steel lifting slowly on hydraulic power to reveal the cavernous opening of the car deck behind it, the ramp dropping to the quayside, and the stream of vehicles driving aboard through the open bow. At sea, the visor closed and became part of the ship's profile, indistinguishable from the hull to anyone watching from the quayside or the deck of a passing vessel, a shell of painted steel that looked as permanent and as solid as the bow itself. The visor was meant to serve as a weather cover. The ramp behind it was supposed to be the watertight boundary. The visor kept the spray and the seas off the ramp and gave the bow its streamlined shape for the open crossing. The locks that held it in place were hydraulically operated, 3 of them, 1 on each side and 1 on the center line at the bottom, called the Atlantic lock. In closed position, These locks pulled the visor tight against rubber packing seals on the forepeak deck and both front bulkheads. The visor's own weight, 65 tons pressing down from above, helped compress the seals. The arrangement was simple. When the visor was lowered, the locks engaged, the rubber compressed, and the bow was sealed against the weather. When the ship reached port, the locks were released. The hydraulic actuators lifted the visor on its hinge arms, and the ramp dropped to the quayside. The design assumption embedded in this arrangement was simple and, in hindsight, lethal. The locks were dimensioned to hold the visor snug against the packings. They were not designed as structural members capable of absorbing repeated dynamic wave loads. They pulled the visor down and in. They did not brace it against the upward, slamming force of a wave hitting the visor's flat underside at speed. The hinges were the true structural connection between the visor and the ship, two arms extending roughly 3 meters aft from the visor shell, each carrying lug plates welded to support bushings. If the hinges held, the system held. If the hinges failed, the locks would suddenly be bearing forces in directions and at magnitudes they were never built for. The Atlantic lock, in particular, was a backup that would become the last defense, and it would break immediately under loads it was never meant to carry. This was known. A safety report published in 1974 had concluded, in blunt language, that nearly all locking devices of bow doors on existing vessels are too weak. The report had been filed. The vessels had continued to sail. The finding had been absorbed into the background noise of maritime safety. One more warning among many. A risk that was known and accepted because the consequences of the assumption failing had never been tested at sea on a vessel carrying 1,000 people. The 1974 report gathered dust in maritime libraries across Northern Europe, its conclusions as valid and as ignored as the day they were written. While the ferries sailed, and the car decks loaded, and the visors opened and closed, and the locks engaged, and the lights on the bridge showed green. The two hinge arms were fabricated from structural steel platings, with lug plates welded to support bushings by circular fillet welds. The quality of those welds would become the most important detail in the entire story, because the forensic investigation that followed the disaster found that the welds had been poorly made from the beginning. They showed what the metallurgists called poor fusion and lack of penetration, construction defects from the yard in 1980 that created stress concentration points at exactly the places where cyclic wave loading would, over 14 years of Baltic service, initiate fatigue cracks and drive them deeper with every crossing, every wave, every ordinary night at sea. The flaws were invisible to any external inspection. They lived inside the metal, in the grain boundaries, in the molecular seams where the weld had failed to bond properly to the parent steel, and they grew a fraction of a millimeter at a time, fed by the rhythm of the sea. The routine survey that was supposed to catch the degradation of these connections was not designed to find it. The visor was inspected externally. The locks were tested for engagement. The rubber packings were checked for compression. But the internal welds, the fillet welds that held the hinge plates to the support bushings, the circular welds that held the Atlantic lock lugs to the forepeak deck, these were hidden connections buried inside the structure of the visor attachment system, and they were never subjected to the kind of deep, non-destructive testing that would have revealed the fatigue cracks growing inside them. The visor was inspected the way a house is inspected by walking through it. The walls looked solid, the doors closed properly, and no one cut into the walls to examine the foundations. The visor was the planted gun. It had been fitted with precision, inspected on schedule, operated thousands of times in every weather the Baltic could produce, and it carried within it, from the day it was built, the mechanism of its own failure. Chapter 3. A New Flag and a Familiar Route. In 1993, newly independent Estonia bought the ferry and renamed her, and she became the most prominent vessel connecting the Baltic state to Scandinavia. She had already lived 3 lives under 3 names. Viking Sally for a decade on the Stockholm to Mariehamn to Turku route. Silja Star briefly in 1990. Wasa King in 1991 when another operator took her on. Now she was the Estonia, flagship of Estline, the joint venture between the Estonian shipping company and the Swedish firm Nordstrom and Thulin, running the overnight service between Tallinn and Stockholm. She commenced service under the Estonian flag on the 2nd of February 1993. She was 14 years old by then, a mature vessel with the scars and the competence of long service, and she carried on her hull the weight of a country's ambitions. For the new nation, she was more than a ferry. Estonia had regained its independence after decades of Soviet occupation, and the Tallinn to Stockholm route was the country's most visible physical link to Western Europe. The Estonia carried business people opening offices in Stockholm, students heading to Swedish universities, families visiting relatives who had emigrated during the occupation years, and tourists discovering a country that had been closed to the West for decades. She was always full. She was a symbol of connection, of openness, of a small country's insistence on its place in the wider world. The Estonian flag at her stern was a statement that the country existed, that it traded, that it moved. For a small nation still finding its footing after decades of Soviet rule, the ferry to Stockholm was the open door that proved the walls had truly come down. Every sailing carried a cargo of national meaning that no manifest could record. The hope of a country that had spent decades behind a curtain and was now, week by week, crossing by crossing, stitching itself back into the fabric of Northern Europe. By the time of her final sailing, she was the flagship of Estonian maritime pride, the most prominent vessel connecting the newly independent nation to Scandinavia. She was a workhorse with a known pedigree and a known set of minor mechanical complaints, none of which had ever been serious enough to delay a sailing. She passed her surveys. She sailed. Her 9 decks had been refitted to meet the expectations of a new market, her cabins freshened, her lounges stocked with the duty-free goods that drove the economics of every Baltic ferry. Below the passenger spaces, the car decks remained as they had been built, open, unpartitioned, loading through the bow visor and ramp at the forward end and through the stern door aft. Her master on the final voyage was Captain Arvo Andresson. He was 40 years old, born on the 3rd of February 1954, trained in the Soviet maritime system, and he had 23 years of experience at sea. He knew the route. He knew the ship. He knew the Baltic in autumn, the way the westerlies built after the equinox, the way the swells lengthened and steepened as the storms tracked across from the North Sea. His bridge crew were experienced officers who knew the route and the ship and the weather patterns of the autumn Baltic. Also aboard that night, but off duty, was Avo Pete, the chief mate. Pite was one of the rotating captains, but he was not in command on this crossing. He was travelling as a passenger, bound for Stockholm to sit his pilot's examination. He had no watch to stand. He had no reason to be on the bridge. He had no cause to expect that, before the night was over, he would be standing at the stern of a sinking ship, distributing life jackets to passengers who had minutes to live. He had planned his day in Stockholm. The ordinariness of his intentions made what followed almost unbearable to reconstruct. Among the 803 passengers were Kent Harstedt, a 23-year-old Swede, and Sara Hedrenius, a 20-year-old Swedish student returning to Stockholm after visiting her father. They did not know each other. They had no connection to each other, to the crew, or to the ship. They were simply two young people on an overnight ferry crossing, doing what tens of thousands of Baltic travelers did every week, boarding in the evening, finding their cabins, planning to wake up in Stockholm. On the evening of the 27th of September, 1994, the Estonia departed Tallinn at approximately 7 in the evening, bound for Stockholm on her regular overnight crossing. The weather forecast warned of a southwesterly autumn storm developing over the Baltic. Winds of 15 to 20 meters per second, gusting higher. Significant wave heights of 3 to 4 meters. The crew noted the forecast. It was late September. Storms were the ordinary currency of the Baltic autumn. The Estonia had sailed through worse. The passengers settled into their cabins, stowed their bags, arranged their belongings on the narrow shelves, and prepared for the routine of an overnight crossing. The children were put to bed. The couples went to dinner. The businessmen opened their briefcases in the lounges. The ship moved out of Tallinn harbour, past the breakwater, into the open Baltic, and the last lights of the Estonian coast fell away behind her, and the dark of the open sea closed in from every side. She sailed again. Chapter 4. The sister who broke first. 20 months before the Estonia sailed into her last storm, her near sister had already shown what the Visor could do. The Diana II had been delivered by Meyer Werft in 1979, 1 year before the Viking Sally. She was the forerunner and near sister of the Estonia, built to the same basic design at the same yard, with a virtually identical bow visor and attachment system. Both ships had been built at the same yard to the same basic design, and both had worked the Baltic routes. The Diana II's crew knew the Visor intimately. Her chief mate, Carl Ola Lindros, who had served on the vessel from delivery until 1990, later stated plainly that it was well known to all navigators that the bow visor was the most sensitive part of the vessel and was endangered in head-on seas at too high speed. There had always been problems with the visor's mechanical systems. The bolt of the Atlantic lock was difficult to open and close, and had eventually been thinned by 5 millimeters to ease the operation. The rubber packings froze to the visor bottom in winter, gripping the steel with a bond that had to be broken each time the bow was opened for loading. These were the small, chronic complaints of a mechanical system that worked, mostly, but never worked elegantly, and that required a crew who understood its habits and treated it with care. It was the kind of machinery that rewarded familiarity and punished neglect, and the Diana II's crews had learned its moods over a decade of daily service. By the early 1990s, the Diana II had passed through the bankruptcy of her operator and been taken on by TR Line for the Rostock to Trelleborg service in the southern Baltic, making 3 crossings daily, 2 at full speed in daylight and 1 overnight at reduced speed of approximately 12 knots. The visor opened and closed 3 times a day, the locks engaged and released 3 times a day, the hinges bore the weight of the visor 3 times a day, and the Baltic delivered its loads to the steel with the patience and the persistence that the sea brings to everything it touches. On the morning of the 16th of January, 1993, just 2 days after a hurricane that had sunk the ferry Jan Heulius with the loss of all aboard, the Diana II was crossing from Rostock to Trelleborg in a storm of Beaufort Force 10. The Baltic was still convulsing from the weather that had killed the Heulius, and the seas were very rough, the kind of water that turns a ship into a battering ram against its own forward structures. Chief mates Lindros and Hartwigson were on their handover round in the forward part of the car deck when they noticed water leaking through the bow ramp. After the vessel reached the shelter of the shore, both mates entered the inside of the Visor through the hatch on the forecastle deck and found considerable damage to the hydraulic side locks and the Atlantic lock. The manual side locks had not been engaged, a detail that meant the visor had been relying entirely on the hydraulic locks and the hinges to hold it against the force of the storm. What they found was devastating. The starboard lock lug had been torn off completely and was lost overboard. The Atlantic lock lug was bent and its weld cracked. The port side lock lug was bent and its weld cracked. A crack had appeared at the starboard hinge. Internal girders and web structures were cracked. The visor had come within a margin of failure that no dry damage report could convey. If the crossing had been longer, if the seas had been rougher for another hour, if the speed had been a few knots higher, the Diana II could have lost her visor entirely, and the Baltic would have claimed her the same way it would claim the Estonia 20 months later. Repairs were carried out locally in Trelleborg over 2 days by a local engineering firm. The Bureau Veritas surveyor attended and inspected the completed work. Captain Soda informed the Swedish Maritime Safety Inspectorate in Malmö by telephone and invited them for survey. Due to lack of time, the inspectorate said, this was allegedly not possible. The safety inspector confirmed that the Bureau Veritas survey was sufficient and said the repairs would be inspected later. The inspection was performed approximately 3 months afterwards. No fleet-wide alert was issued. No circular was sent to operators of similar vessels. No re-examination of the bow visors on sister ships or vessels of the same design was ordered. The Estonia's owners, Nordstrom and Thulin, and the Estonian Shipping Company were not notified. The Estonia's crew were not informed that their ship's near twin had just suffered a catastrophic failure of the same visor attachment system that held their own bow together. The warning had already been given. It was repaired locally, filed in a surveyor's report in a port office in Trelleborg, and never transmitted to the people who needed it most. The lesson stayed in the filing cabinet. The sea kept its counsel. And 20 months later, the Estonia would sail into the same kind of storm, on the same sea, with the same visor, and her crew would have no knowledge that the failure they were about to experience had already happened once before. Chapter 5. What no one could see. By the time the Estonia left Tallinn for the last time, the connections holding her bow visor to the ship were already substantially broken. No one aboard knew it. No inspection had found it. No survey had tested the welds that mattered. But the forensic evidence recovered after the disaster told the story of a structure that had been failing for years. Silently, in the dark spaces between the steel, in the molecular boundaries where corroded metal gives way grain by grain. The stempost, the vertical member at the very front of the visor where it met the ship's bow, had separated from the shell plating during normal service. The welds between the stempost and the plating had failed through a spectrum of cyclic loading combined with the long-term corrosive action of seawater that had entered through the opened welds over years. The stempost was split into 4 separate pieces by crack development. One crack had penetrated approximately 40% of the stempost's total thickness. The metal had been bending and breaking and bending again, cycle by cycle, wave by wave, in a rhythm that no one could hear and no instrument was set to detect. Inside that crack, the investigators from the University of the Armed Forces in Hamburg found traces of blue ice paint that had been applied to the visor in January 1994, when the Estonia had been in the shipyard for the last time, 8 months before her final voyage. The paint had seeped into the crack at a time when it had already penetrated the stempost to approximately 40% of its depth. This was physical proof, undeniable and precise, that the visor's primary vertical structural member had been substantially broken for at least 8 months before the storm that sank the ship. The crack was there when the paint went on. The paint went on in January. The ship sailed until September. 8 months of crossings, 8 months of waves, 8 months of passengers boarding through the bow and sleeping above a visor that was held together by the metal that remained. The Atlantic lock was worse. The 3 lugs welded to the forepeak deck, the fittings that the lock bolt engaged to hold the visor's bottom tight against the ship, had been pre-cracked by fatigue across approximately 90% of the total weld length between the lugs and their bushings. The visor's mating lug, the corresponding fitting on the visor itself, had been deformed by bending of 15 to 20 degrees to starboard, and its bore had expanded from the original 85 millimeters to an oval measuring 91 by 105 millimeters, stretched and distorted by sustained aft-directed force over years of service. The bore that should have been a clean circle was an egg, and the egg was the shape of 14 years of battering. The deformation pattern indicated that the visor's bottom had tilted forward before the lock failed, a movement that was only possible if the hinges had failed already. The hinges were the most severely pre-damaged of all. The fillet welds between the hinge lug plates and the support bushings had partially failed a considerable time before the casualty, in the words of the Hamburg laboratory. Fatigue cracks had initiated from flame-cutting marks left in the inner bore of the lug plates during original construction in 1980, marks where the steel had been torch-cut instead of machined smooth, creating microscopic notches that served as perfect initiation points for fatigue cracking under cyclic load. These were scars from the day the ship was born, flaws written into the steel at the moment of fabrication, and for 14 years the sea had been reading them. The starboard hinge was the worst. Its upper fractures showed very small fracture edge contractions, meaning the metal had broken with barely any stretching at all, the unmistakable signature of material that was fatigued almost entirely through its cross-section before the final overload. There was almost no sound metal left. The hinge that was supposed to hold 65 tons of visor to the ship had been reduced by 14 years of invisible cracking to a shell of steel around a core of fractures. The investigators concluded that the fillet welds had failed first, letting seawater into the gap between the hinge plates and the bushings. The corrosion reduced the load carrying capacity further. Then the hinge plates themselves began to crack, propagating outward from the flame-cut bore surfaces, driven by the daily wave loads of every ordinary crossing. The starboard hinge likely failed first, with only small plastic deformation. The load shifted to the port hinge, which failed next with greater deformation and bending, consistent with absorbing the transferred load before it too gave way. The hydraulic actuator mountings on B deck were also compromised. The starboard actuator had been torn from its deck support, and the port actuator showed a repair weld at a high-stress location where 50 to 70% of the total load-carrying weld area had been fatigue-cracked. Every crossing for 14 years, the visor had been lowered, locked, and trusted. Every crossing, the cracks had grown a fraction deeper, the welds a fraction weaker, the margin a fraction thinner. The system of inspection that was supposed to catch progressive structural failure had not caught it, because the kind of inspection that would have found it, deep, non-destructive testing of internal welds and hidden structural connections, was not part of the routine survey. The visor opened, closed, and locked. The indicator lights showed green, and because the indicators showed green, the visor was assumed to be sound. The gap between what the visor appeared to be and what it had become was the width of a crack that no one had measured, the depth of a fracture that no one had tested, and the silence of a warning that had been given to the Diana II and never passed on. Chapter 6. An Ordinary Storm. The weather that night was a southwesterly autumn storm, winds of 15 to 20 meters per second, waves of 3 to 4 meters, and it was unremarkable for the Baltic in late September. The Estonian Weather Service had forecast it. The ship's officers had noted it. The passengers had been warned to expect some movement during the night. None of this raised alarm. The Estonia had sailed through storms like this dozens of times. Every ferry on the Tallinn to Stockholm route had sailed through storms like this dozens of times. The Baltic in autumn was a rough sea, and the ferries were built to handle it, and they did. The evening aboard the Estonia had followed its familiar pattern. The ship had cleared Tallinn harbour and turned her bow toward the open Baltic, pushing west-northwest into the gathering swell. The last of the autumn daylight had faded behind the Estonian coast, and the ship's interior lights had come on, casting their warm glow across the lounges and corridors and staircases that connected her 9 decks. The bars and restaurants had done their usual brisk trade through the evening. Passengers had eaten dinner in the buffet, browsed the duty-free shop for spirits and cigarettes and perfume, drunk beer in the lounges while the Baltic rolled beneath them, and gradually retired to their cabins as the night deepened and the motion of the ship settled into the long, steady rhythm of the open crossing. By midnight, most of the 803 passengers were in their berths. The ship's corridors were quiet, lit by the dim overnight lighting, empty except for the occasional crew member on watch or the rare passenger who could not sleep. The ship's motion was noticeable, but not alarming. The long, slow roll of a large vessel in a seaway, the kind of movement that rocked you to sleep if you were used to it and kept you awake if you were not. Outside, the storm had strengthened. The wind was singing in the superstructure, and the spray was reaching the bridge windows, and the bow was lifting and falling with a rhythm that the crew knew by heart. The Baltic was doing what the Baltic did in late September. The darkness was total beyond the ship's lights, a black void of sea and sky and wind that pressed against the hull from every direction. In the cabins, passengers slept under duvets that moved gently with the roll, their bodies swaying in their berths with the unconscious adjustment of people who had learned to sleep on a moving ship. In the engine room, the 4 MAN diesels drove their shafts with the steady throb that was the heartbeat of the vessel, felt through every deck, through every bulkhead, through the steel itself. The ship was alive with the sounds of her own working, the creak of the hull, the hum of the ventilation, the distant rumble of the propellers turning in the water below, and beneath all of it, the persistent, rhythmic thud of the waves striking the bow. The Estonia was heading west-northwest across the open Baltic at her normal cruising speed. The waves were coming from the southwest, meeting the ship on her port bow quarter and working their way forward as the wind strengthened. This was the worst heading for a vessel with a visor and ramp bow arrangement, because each wave struck the visor's flat underside with an upward, slamming force that the locks and hinges had to absorb. The visor's shell plating took the impact and transmitted it through the structural members to the hinge arms and the locking devices. Every wave was a hammer blow on the connections. Every connection was supposed to be sound. But the visor that was taking the waves now was connected to the ship by welds that were 90% cracked, by a stempost split into 4 pieces, by hinges whose filly welds had partially failed, and by an Atlantic lock whose lugs were pre-fatigued through almost their entire length. The margins that had absorbed these loads on every previous crossing had been consumed, wave by wave, crossing by crossing, year by year, and what remained was the last fraction of the designed strength, a thread of sound metal in a system of broken connections. The visor that opened and closed and showed green lights on the bridge was beneath its paint and its packing seals, a structure held together by the remnant of what had once been its full capacity, and the storm outside was asking it to do the same job it had always done, on the same sea, in the same weather, as though nothing had changed. Somewhere below the waterline, somewhere in the dark cavities behind the visor's shell plating where no one could see and no inspection had reached. The remaining margins were being consumed with every wave that struck the bow. Kent Harstedt was aboard. He was 23, Swedish, travelling on the overnight crossing for reasons that would become unimportant by morning. Sara Hedrenius was aboard too, a 20-year-old student heading back to Stockholm after a visit to her father. They did not know each other. They had not spoken. They were in separate parts of the ship, two strangers among 800 others, and in the next hour they would meet in circumstances that neither of them could have imagined, and the meeting would save both their lives. Captain Andresen was on the bridge. The storm was within the ship's operational parameters. The forecast had not warranted a course change or a speed reduction. The Estonia was doing what she did every second night, crossing the Baltic overnight with 989 souls aboard, and there was nothing about this crossing, nothing about this weather, nothing about this night that any officer on that bridge would have called unusual. The difference was inside the bow, in the dark, in the metal, in the cracks. The difference was the 14 years of invisible fatigue damage that had consumed the margins of the visor's structural connections and left behind a system of broken welds and fractured steel that looked, from the outside, from the bridge, from the indicator panel, exactly as it had always looked. The lights showed green. The visor was closed and locked. And beneath the paint and the rubber seals, the last fraction of sound metal was being asked to hold 65 tons of visor against a Baltic autumn storm, and the margin between holding and failing was thinner than it had ever been, and it was about to announce itself. Chapter 7. The first metallic bang. At approximately 5 to 1 in the morning, able seaman Silver Lind heard a loud metallic bang from the bow. It was the sound of steel under stress, of a locking device giving way against wave impact, of the first audible moment of a structural collapse that had been building invisibly for 14 years. It came from deep in the ship's forward section. A sound transmitted through the hull plating, felt as much as heard, the kind of noise that any experienced seaman knows is wrong even before he can identify what caused it. It carried through the steel framework of the ship, the way a crack in a bell carries through the air, a tone that did not belong, a frequency that spoke of something breaking that was supposed to hold. Other crew members in the forward areas heard it too. Passengers in cabins near the bow woke to a noise they could not place. Something heavy, something metallic, something that did not belong to the normal repertoire of sounds a ship makes in a storm. It bore no resemblance to the creak of the hull flexing or the crash of a wave against the bow. It was something structural, something that changed the pitch and rhythm of the ship's voice in a way that anyone who has lived aboard a vessel would recognize as dangerous. Some passengers sat up in their berths, listening in the dim glow of their cabin nightlights, waiting for the sound to repeat or to be explained by the ordinary business of the ship. Some pulled on their clothes and opened their cabin doors and looked into the corridor, looking for a crew member, looking for an explanation, looking for the reassurance that someone in authority knew what the sound had been and that it was nothing. Some turned over and tried to sleep. The distinction between those who moved and those who waited would, in the next 30 minutes, become the distinction between those who lived and those who died. On the bridge, no alarm sounded. There was no sensor system designed to detect the progressive failure of a bow visor in real time. There was no warning light that would tell the officers of the watch that the 65-ton steel shell at the front of their ship was tearing free of its connections. The bridge had indicator lights for the locking devices and the ramp, showing whether they were engaged or released. But the visor's structural integrity, the condition of the welds that held its hinges to the forecastle deck, the state of the stempost, the fatigue loading on the Atlantic lock lugs. These were things that the bridge was never designed to monitor because they were assumed to be permanent. The visor was either open or closed, locked or unlocked. The possibility that it could be locked and closed and still be failing, still be tearing itself free of the ship while the indicator panel showed green, was outside the scope of any instrument aboard. The bang was followed by more sounds, metallic and percussive, transmitted through the hull from the bow. These were the sounds of the remaining connections being overloaded as the visor continued to separate. The failure sequence was cascading now. The locking devices had been weakened by years of fatigue cracking, their weld lengths reduced to 10% of their original capacity. The hinges, the visor's true structural connection, were the most pre-damaged components on the entire ship, with one, the starboard hinge, fatigued almost completely through. Under the repeated slamming forces of the head seas hitting the visor's flat underside, the remaining sound metal in every connection was being asked to carry the full design load, and it could not. The sounds grew louder, more frequent, more urgent, the percussion of a system in its final moments of coherence, and in the cabins and corridors near the bow, passengers listened and wondered, and some began to dress. The sounds carried through the ship's steel skeleton, transmitted from the forward sections through the frames and the bulkheads and the deck plating, weakening with distance, but never vanishing entirely, so that even passengers amidships, even those on the upper decks, could hear or feel something that was foreign to the normal voice of the ship in a storm. The hull was a conductor of sound, and the sounds it was conducting now were the sounds of structural failure, of steel connections giving way one after another in a sequence that had been building for 14 years and was now, in these few minutes, reaching its conclusion. Shortly after 1 a.m, one wave or two waves in rapid succession delivered the final overload. The sequence, reconstructed from the forensic evidence, began with the starboard hinge. Already fatigued almost through its cross-section, it fractured with minimal deformation, the clean break of metal that had no stretch left. The load transferred instantly to the port hinge, which absorbed the shock with greater bending and deformation before it too gave way. With the hinges gone, the 65-ton visor was held to the ship only by the 3 hydraulic locks, and those locks were suddenly bearing forces in an aft and downward direction that they had never been designed for. The Atlantic lock lugs, already 90% cracked through their weld length, ruptured. The 3 lugs that were welded to the forepeak deck broke first at their circular welds, then by overload shear, the remaining 10% of sound weld giving way in an instant. The side locks tore free, the starboard lug ripped from the visor bulkhead, the port lug tearing with a more vertical movement. The visor separated from the MS Estonia. As it fell forward and away from the bow, it caught the car loading ramp behind it and pulled it partially open, wrenching the ramp from its closed and sealed position and exposing the car deck to the sea. The visor, 65.5 tons of steel, plunged into the Baltic and sank to the seabed. And through the gaping wound where the bow of the ship had been, the sea came in. Chapter 8. The sea comes in. With the bow visor gone and the ramp torn open, the Baltic poured onto the car deck at a rate no design had ever planned for. The opening was enormous, the full width and height of the forward ramp, an aperture that admitted the sea in a torrent, wave after wave, driving through the shattered bow as the ship continued to push forward into the storm. The ship was still making speed, still driving her open wound into the oncoming waves, and every wave that struck the exposed bow face sent hundreds of tons of seawater surging across the steel plating of the car deck. The water came in black and cold, 4 degrees of the Baltic pouring through the opening with the force and volume of a river in flood. and the car deck had no defense against it. The noise was immense, the roar of the sea entering the ship amplified by the cavernous steel chamber of the car deck, echoing off the hull plating and the vehicle decks above, a sound that carried through the structure of the ship and told everyone aboard, if they were awake to hear it, that something fundamental had changed. The car deck ran the full length of the ship, open and unpartitioned, 155 meters of flat steel, with no internal barriers, no watertight bulkheads, no means of containing or channeling or limiting the water that was now flooding through the bow. The vehicles parked in their rows, the lorries and cars that passengers had driven aboard in Tallinn, stood in the rising water like buildings in a floodplain, obstacles that broke the flow but could not stop it, could not slow it, could not prevent the sea from reaching every corner of that vast open space. This was the known vulnerability of every ro-ro ferry in the world, the same design weakness that had killed 193 people on the Herald of Free Enterprise 7 years earlier. An unpartitioned car deck was a convenience for loading vehicles and a death sentence if the sea got in. The car deck of the Estonia was roughly the size of a football pitch, and the sea was filling it with the speed and the force of a river breaching a dam. The free surface effect took hold within minutes. Hundreds of tons of seawater sloshed freely across the full width of the car deck, 24 meters beam to beam, moving with the ship's roll like water in a bathtub. Each roll to starboard sent the water surging to the starboard side, and the weight of it pushed the ship further over. Each recovery was a little shallower, a little slower, because the water stayed longer on the low side, and more water poured in through the bow with every wave. The physics was simple, and it was merciless. The weight of free water on an unpartitioned deck amplifies every roll. A 15-degree list becomes 20. 20 becomes 30. The deeper the list, the faster the water flows to the low side, and the deeper the list becomes. It is a feedback loop with no stable equilibrium. Once it begins, it accelerates, and the car deck that was the size of a football pitch became a catchment for the sea, a reservoir of shifting weight that turned the ship against herself with every roll. Within minutes of the Visor's departure, the Estonia was listing more than 15 degrees to starboard. The change was violent and sudden for the passengers inside. People were thrown from their bunks. Furniture that had been bolted to the deck tore free and slid across cabins. Glasses shattered behind bars. Bottles rolled and smashed. Belongings cascaded from shelves and tables and struck the walls that were becoming floors. The ship's internal corridors, designed for level walking, became tilted chutes. Stairways that ran athwart ships became nearly vertical climbs. Cabin doors on the high side swung open under their own weight. Doors on the low side jammed shut, pressed into their frames by the shifting mass of the tilting superstructure. The sound of water was everywhere now. The deep rush and surge of the flooding car deck below, transmitted through the hull as a vibration that passengers could feel through the walls and the floors of their cabins. The whole ship was shuddering with the asymmetric weight of the water on the car deck, a tremor that ran through the steel and through the bodies of the passengers who pressed themselves against the walls and tried to stay upright, tried to understand, tried to think of what to do next. The corridors smelled of salt water now, the sharp, cold scent of the Baltic seeping up from below, and the air felt different, heavier, charged with the moisture and the cold of the sea that was rising through the ship from underneath. The alarm sounded through the ship, but the alarm was almost redundant. Every passenger could feel the ship dying beneath them. The floor was no longer level. The walls were no longer vertical. The sound of water, of metal groaning, of objects crashing, filled the corridors. The question was not whether something was wrong. The question was whether they could get out. For those on the upper decks, near the outer doors and the open deck, there was still a chance. The lifeboats and rafts were above them. If they could stand and walk and climb the tilted stairways, they could reach the open air. For those on the lower decks, deep inside the ship, in the cabins closest to the car deck, the chance was vanishing by the second. The corridors were tilting past the angle at which a human being could walk upright. The stairs were becoming walls. The water was rising through the lower decks, cold and black and silent, filling the spaces below them with the patience of the sea. And the ship was rolling onto its side with them inside it. The time between the Visor's departure and this moment was measured in minutes, and the minutes were running out, and the angle of the deck beneath their feet was telling them so with a clarity that no alarm could match. Chapter 9. The ship on her side. By 1:15 in the morning, the list had reached 30 degrees, and the Estonia was dying. People inside the ship were no longer walking through corridors. They were crawling along walls that had become floors, climbing over door frames that had become horizontal ledges, sliding down surfaces that had been vertical a quarter of an hour ago. The darkness made it worse. The emergency lighting cast a dim orange glow that turned the tilted corridors into something from a fever dream, shadows lengthening and shifting as the ship rolled, the angles of the walls and floors changing with every wave, every surge of the water below. The sounds were those of a building collapsing in slow motion, the deep groaning of the hull flexing under asymmetric loading, the crash of loose equipment sliding across compartments, the high, sharp screaming of people who were trapped and could not find a way out. Water was entering the passenger accommodation now, not just through the car deck, but through every opening on the submerging starboard side. Portholes that had been above the waterline were going under. Doors to the outer deck on the starboard side were submerging. The Baltic was climbing the hull from the outside while it surged across the car deck on the inside, and the two floods were meeting somewhere in the middle of the ship, filling compartments that had been dry cabins minutes before. The cold water rose through the lower decks with a patience that mocked the panic above it, filling one space after another, one corridor after another, closing off escape routes that had been passable moments before. On the car deck, the vehicles that had been parked in neat rows were sliding and colliding in the rising water, lorries and cars pushed by the current and the tilt into tangled heaps against the starboard side, their metal bodies grinding against each other and against the hull, with a sound that added to the cacophony of a ship tearing itself apart. At approximately 1:20, the main engines stopped. One by one, the 4 MAN diesels shut down as the lubricating oil drained to the low side of the engine sump, and the pressure dropped below the threshold at which the engines could safely operate. The list had exceeded 30 degrees, and the automatic cutoffs engaged to prevent the engines from seizing. The propellers stopped turning. The Estonia lost propulsion. She was now a dead ship, lying broadside to the waves, with no power to steer, no power to turn her bow away from the seas still pouring through the open ramp, and no means of slowing the flooding that was killing her. The silence when the engines stopped was a sound of its own, an absence that every person aboard understood. A ship without engines is a ship at the mercy of the sea, and the sea that night had no mercy to give. At 1:22, a Mayday distress call was transmitted from the radio room. The position given was approximately 59 degrees 23 minutes north, 21 degrees 42 minutes east, in open water between Estonia and Finland, 22 nautical miles from the Finnish island of Uto. The call did not follow the standard international distress format, and this caused delays in the wider emergency response. The urgency of the situation was not immediately clear to the stations that received it. A full-scale emergency was not declared until 2:30, more than an hour after the Visor had detached, more than 40 minutes after the ship had vanished beneath the surface. By 1:25, the list exceeded 40 degrees. At this angle, escape from inside the ship was virtually impossible for anyone still below the outer decks. The internal corridors were angled beyond the capacity of most people to climb. Stairways had become vertical shafts. The starboard side of the vessel was fully submerged. Water was pouring in through every opening, every vent, every window on the low side. Those still inside the ship were being entombed by the rising water and the falling angle of the deck beneath them. The window of possible escape, from the Visor's separation to this moment, had lasted perhaps 20 to 25 minutes, and for most passengers it had been far shorter, measured in the time it took to wake, to understand, to dress, to find the corridor, to discover that the corridor was impassable, and to know that it was too late. Arvo Pete, the off-duty chief mate who had been aboard as a passenger for his pilot's examination, had made his way to Deck 7. He and boatswain Velo Ruben took up position at the stern, distributing life jackets to passengers, directing them toward the remaining accessible exits, doing the urgent, instinctive work of officers on a ship that had passed the point where any officer could save it. Pite was not on duty. He had no obligation to be there. He was there because he was a seaman, and the ship was sinking, and people needed help. Eyewitnesses placed him at the rear door in the final minutes before the stern submerged. He was never found among the living. His body was never recovered. Some witnesses later claimed that a man resembling Pite had been seen being airlifted by helicopter and stepping from an ambulance in Sweden, but the official investigation concluded he had likely gone down with the Estonia. His fate became one of the enduring mysteries of the disaster, a question that the Baltic would keep to itself. Captain Anderson remained on the bridge. He did not survive. What he understood in those final minutes, what orders he gave, what he saw from the wheelhouse windows as the Baltic rose to meet them, died with him and his bridge crew. The demographics of survival were already being determined by physics and position. Those who survived were overwhelmingly younger, fitter, and located on or near the upper decks when the list began. They were people who could physically climb through a ship tilted at 40 or 50 degrees, who could force open jammed doors, who could haul themselves up stairways that had become near vertical, who could cling to the rising port side of the hull as the starboard side went under. The elderly could not do this. Children could not do this. Those in the lower cabins, deep inside the ship, in the corridors that had become vertical shafts and the stairways that had become cliffs, could not do this. Of all the children under the age of 12 aboard the MS Estonia that night, only one would survive. Chapter 10. Two Strangers in the Dark. Kent Harstedt was 23, and Sarah Hedrenius was 20, and they had met on the ship that night as strangers who became bound to each other by the simple mathematics of survival. They had found each other in the chaos of the tilting decks, two young people among hundreds who were trying to reach the open air, and in the confusion and the noise and the dark, they had made a decision that would define both their lives. The abandoned ship horn sounded through the Estonia. It was, for many passengers, the first clear signal that the ship was not going to recover, that this was not a storm-induced roll that would correct itself, that the ferry was going down. Around them, on the upper decks and the exposed sections of the outer hull, passengers and crew were struggling to reach the lifeboats and life rafts. But the list made deployment almost impossible on the starboard side, where the davits were pointing at the water, and extremely difficult on the port side, where the davits were pointing at the sky. Rafts were launched, but many landed upside down or were swept away by the waves before anyone could climb aboard. The system designed to save lives in an orderly evacuation was failing because the ship was not sinking in an orderly way. She was rolling over, and the equipment that was supposed to save her passengers had been designed for a ship that stayed upright long enough to use it. The evacuation procedures assumed time. The Estonia gave almost none. Harstedt and Hedrenius made the choice together, or perhaps the sea made it for them. They held hands and let a wave wash them off the ship and into the Baltic. The water was 4 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, the body's response is immediate and violent. The cold shock drives an involuntary gasp that can fill the lungs with water if the head is submerged. The blood vessels in the skin constrict instantly, forcing blood to the core, spiking blood pressure. The heart races. The muscles stiffen. An unprotected person in water at 4 degrees has roughly 30 to 90 minutes of useful consciousness before hypothermia causes incapacitation, after which drowning follows quickly. The clock that mattered now was measured in the body's ability to hold its own warmth against the cold of the Baltic, and the Baltic was patient and relentless and very, very cold. The survival window for an unprotected person in that water, roughly 30 to 90 minutes before incapacitation, was a cruel arithmetic that would determine who lived through the night and who did not. They reached an overturned life raft. It was already occupied, 14 other survivors clinging to the capsized raft in the dark, half submerged, half exposed to the wind and the spray. Harstedt and Hedrenius were hauled aboard or climbed aboard, and they joined the group in the water, sitting in the sea to their waists, holding on to the raft's handholds and to each other. The raft rose and fell with the waves, the cold water surging over their legs and their torsos with each swell, draining away and surging back, and the wind stripped the warmth from their wet skin with every gust. Above them, the sky was black. Around them, the sea was black. Behind them, the lights of the Estonia were tilting and dimming as the ship rolled further onto her side. And then the lights went out, and there was only the dark and the cold and the sound of the storm. The hours that followed were the longest and the coldest of their lives. The water temperature was the enemy now, more dangerous than the storm, more relentless than the waves. Hypothermia took the weakest first. One by one, the people around them on the raft stopped shivering, stopped moving, stopped answering when spoken to. Their muscles locked. Their consciousness faded. They slumped against the raft or into the water and did not come back. Bodies drifted against the legs of those still conscious, bumping gently in the swell. A contact that the survivors could feel but could not prevent and could not endure thinking about. Harstedt and Hedrenius stayed alive by staying awake, and they stayed awake by refusing to let each other close their eyes. They hugged for warmth, wrapping their arms around each other, sharing what little body heat remained. They told jokes. They forced conversation. They kept each other's minds working, kept the blood moving, kept the thread of consciousness from breaking. Harstedt told Hedrenius he would take her to dinner in Stockholm if they survived. It was a small thing, a promise made in the dark to a stranger, but it was also the only thing either of them had to hold on to: a future, a meal, a warm room, a reason to keep breathing. Of the 14 other people who had been on their life raft when they climbed aboard, only 4 were still alive when the Coast Guard helicopter reached them approximately 5 hours after they had entered the water. The rest had died of hypothermia in the dark, in the cold, within arm's reach of people who could do nothing for them except watch them go. Harstedt and Hedrenius were winched to safety. They both survived. Kent Harstedt would go on to become a member of the Swedish Parliament. Sarah Hedrenius would become a resilience advocate and speaker, carrying the story of that night into a life dedicated to understanding how people survive what should have killed them. They had their dinner in Stockholm. The promise that had been made in the dark on a capsized raft in 4-degree water, with the dead pressing against their legs, was kept. It was a small redemption in a story that offered almost none, a thread of warmth in a narrative of cold, and it endured because the two people who made it refused, through the longest night of their lives, to let each other go. Chapter 11. The ship vanishes. At approximately 1:50 in the morning, the MS Estonia disappeared from the surface of the Baltic Sea. The list had passed 60 degrees, the superstructure fully submerged, the hull rolling over until the port side rose above the waterline and the keel began to show. Then 80 degrees, the hull nearly horizontal, the vast flat bottom of the ship exposed briefly to the storm, like the belly of something that had been turned over by a force far greater than itself. Then she was gone, sliding beneath the surface, taking with her the hundreds of people still trapped inside, in the cabins and corridors and stairwells that had become sealed compartments as the water rose and the air compressed and the ship settled into her final descent. The sound she made as she went, the hiss and the rush of air escaping from compartments that were flooding faster than the sea could fill them, carried across the water to the survivors on rafts and in the sea, a sound that marked the moment when the ship that had carried them ceased to exist on the surface of the world. She sank in approximately 74 to 85 meters of water, coming to rest on the seabed on her starboard side, on soft clay overlying stiff boulder clay, 22 nautical miles from the Finnish island of Uto. The wreck settled into the sediment and stopped, her superstructure pressing into the clay. Her port side raised toward the surface she would never reach again. The position was approximately 59 degrees 23 minutes north, 21 degrees 42 minutes east, in the open water between Estonia, Finland, and Sweden. The darkness of the Baltic floor closed around her. The currents moved across her hull, the way wind moves across a fallen building, gently, persistently, carrying away the traces of what had been a vessel full of sleeping passengers less than an hour before. Above, on the surface, the storm continued, indifferent, the waves rolling over the place where the Estonia had been, as though she had never existed, as though 989 people had not been there minutes before, sleeping and breathing and alive. The entire catastrophe, from the first metallic bang heard by Silver Lind at approximately 5 to 1 in the morning to the moment the ship vanished beneath the waves, lasted approximately 55 minutes. Less than an hour. Less than the running time of a television drama. Less time than most of the passengers would have needed to dress, orient themselves in the dark and the tilt, navigate the corridors, climb the stairs, reach the open deck, find a raft, and get into it. The ship had listed from upright to 80 degrees in approximately 40 minutes, faster than most people could complete the sequence of actions needed to save themselves, even if they had known what those actions were, even if the corridors had been level, and the stairs had been straight, and the lights had been on. The window in which escape was physically possible was far shorter than 55 minutes. From the Visor's separation shortly after 1 in the morning to the list exceeding 40 degrees at approximately 1:25, there were perhaps 20 to 25 minutes in which a passenger inside the ship could reach an outer deck. After 40 degrees, the internal routes were impassable for most people. After that, only those already outside, already on the hull, already in the water, had a chance. And that chance depended on finding something to cling to, and then surviving the cold, and then being found by a rescue that was still an hour or more away. 852 people died. Of 989 aboard, only 137 survived. It was the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in European waters, and the second deadliest ferry disaster in history after the MV Donna Paz in 1987. The dead were overwhelmingly those who could not escape, passengers trapped in cabins that became tombs, in corridors that became vertical shafts, in a ship that rolled onto her side and sank before most of those inside could reach the open air. Only one child under the age of 12 survived. The demographic of the dead reflected who could physically climb through a ship listing at 40, 50, 60 degrees in darkness, and who could not. The survival rate was 14%. The death rate was 86%. The numbers were the arithmetic of a catastrophe that had given almost no one enough time to save themselves. The dead outnumbered the living by more than 6 to 1. The sea had taken them in the dark, in the cold, in the tilting corridors and the flooding cabins, and the water that rose faster than anyone could climb. She had sunk because a 65-ton bow visor, connected to the ship by welds that were cracked through 90% of their length, by a stempost that was split into 4 pieces, by hinges whose fillet welds had failed a considerable time before the disaster, had been asked to do what it had done every crossing for 14 years. Hold the sea out. And on one ordinary night in the Baltic, in a storm that was unremarkable and a sea that was familiar, the accumulation of invisible damage exceeded the last remaining margin, and the visor came free, and the ramp opened, and the car deck flooded, and the free surface effect turned a list into a capsize, and the capsize turned a ferry into a grave in less than an hour. The warning had already been given. The Diana II had shown, 20 months earlier, that this visor on this class of ship could and did fail under routine Baltic storm conditions. That warning had been repaired in a shipyard in Trelleborg, documented in a surveyor's report, filed in an office, and never transmitted to the people who needed it. Chapter 12. The Cold Water and the Rescue. The ferry. Mariella was the first vessel to reach the scene, arriving at 2:12 in the morning, 50 minutes after the Mayday. She had altered course the moment the distress call was received, pushing through the storm toward the position, and when she arrived, she found the sea scattered with life rafts, debris, and people in the water. The Estonia was gone. The surface was a chaos of wreckage and cold. The storm that had sunk the Estonia was still blowing, the waves still running at 3 to 4 meters, the wind still driving spray across the water, and the darkness was complete. The deep autumn darkness of the northern Baltic, where no light reaches the sea, except what the ships themselves carry. Mariella's crew began the rescue immediately, working in conditions that were barely survivable themselves. They winched open life rafts into the sea alongside the ship and maneuvered close to the Estonia's deployed rafts, attempting to transfer survivors in heavy seas and near total darkness. Survivors on the Estonia's rafts were transferred across to Mariella's rafts, but the waves made close approach dangerous. The darkness made it nearly impossible to identify survivors among the debris, and the cold was killing the people they were trying to save with every minute that passed. The searchlights from the Mariella swept across the water, picking out shapes that might have been rafts or bodies or wreckage, the beams cutting through the spray and the darkness in narrow arcs that could only illuminate a fraction of the vast search area at any moment. The survivors were scattered across a wide swathe of sea, carried by currents and wind, drifting further apart with every minute. And the Mariella's crew worked with the desperate efficiency of seamen who understood that every minute of delay was another life lost to the cold. Other vessels altered course toward the position as the distress call was relayed through the coastal stations, their bows turning into the storm, their engines driving them toward a patch of Baltic that was already becoming a graveyard. The full-scale emergency was not declared until 2:30 in the morning, more than an hour after the visor had detached, and more than 40 minutes after the ship had vanished. The delay meant that the wider rescue apparatus, the helicopters, the Coast Guard vessels, the coordinated search pattern, was mobilized later than it might have been. Swedish and Finnish rescue helicopters were scrambled from bases across the northern Baltic, and the first helicopter arrived on scene at 3:05, more than 2 hours after the sinking began and more than an hour after the Estonia had gone under. The helicopters worked through the remainder of the night and into the grey Baltic dawn, their crews lowering rescue swimmers into the sea and winching survivors from rafts and from the water, racing against the hypothermia that was claiming lives faster than the rescue could reach them. The water temperature was approximately 4 degrees Celsius, and at that temperature the body loses core heat steadily and irreversibly. A person immersed in 4-degree water without thermal protection loses the ability to swim or hold onto a raft within 30 to 90 minutes. The muscles stop responding. The fingers uncurl. The grip that is the only thing between a survivor and the sea weakens and fails, and the person slips beneath the surface without a sound. Unconsciousness follows. Death follows that. Those who had reached life rafts lasted longer than those in the open water, but many of the rafts were capsized, partially submerged, or awash in spray, and the wind chill on exposed wet skin accelerated the cooling. The cold was patient. It took the oldest first, the smallest first, the weakest first, and it worked its way through the survivors on the rafts and in the water with the thoroughness of something that had all night and all the sea to work with. The cold killed many who had survived the sinking itself, who had escaped the ship, who had made it to the surface, who had found something to hold on to, and who then died, one by one, waiting for a rescue that was still an hour away, in the dark, in the cold, in the Baltic. The cruelty of it was precise. These were people who had done everything right, who had climbed through a tilting ship, who had reached the deck, who had found a raft, who had survived the fall into the water and the shock of the cold and the chaos of the waves, and who then died of hypothermia because the rescue could not reach them in time. The sea that had sunk the Estonia continued to claim her passengers long after the ship herself had gone, taking them gently, patiently, one body at a time, until the helicopters arrived and the winches descended and the cold's work was interrupted but not undone. Of 989 people aboard the MS Estonia, 137 survived. The survival rate was 14%. The toll was 852 dead. The crew who had sailed from Tallinn that night were among the dead. The dead were overwhelmingly passengers trapped inside the ship. Only one child under the age of 12 survived. The dead included Captain Arvo Andresson, who went down with his ship. The dead included Arvo Pete, who spent his last minutes at the stern handing out life jackets with the competence and the calm of a man who had spent his life at sea and who chose, in the end, to spend his death there too. The bodies of most of the dead were never recovered. They remained inside the ship, in the cabins and corridors where they had been trapped when the list became impassable, 74 to 85 meters below the surface of the Baltic Sea. The families of the dead were left with an absence that had no resolution, no body to bury, no grave to visit, only the knowledge that their people were inside a ship on the seabed in the middle of the Baltic, in the cold and the dark, in a place that no one could reach. Chapter 13. The Inquiry and the Sealed Grave. The Joint Accident Investigation Commission published its final report in 1997, and it blamed the Visor. The conclusion was unequivocal. The sinking commenced with the failure of the Visor's locking devices and hinges under wave forces that exceeded the design capability of the attachments in their degraded state. The visor separated. The ramp opened. The car deck flooded. The ship capsized. The report was widely criticized by families and independent researchers for perceived gaps. Insufficient attention to why the Visor's pre-existing damage had never been detected, inadequate scrutiny of the Classification Society's inspection regime, and the decision to leave the ship where she lay and the dead where they had drowned. But the report's real force lay in the forensic detail that supported its conclusion, the evidence of a structure that had been dying for years before the storm that finished it. The stempost split into 4 pieces. The Atlantic lock welds cracked through 90% of their length. The hinge fillet welds partially failed a considerable time before the casualty. The starboard hinge fatigued almost entirely through its load-bearing cross-section. The flame-cutting marks from 1980 that had served as initiation points for 14 years of fatigue cracking. The blue paint from January 1994 found inside a crack that proved the damage was at least 8 months old. Every piece of forensic evidence pointed to the same conclusion. The Estonia had been sailing for years with a bow visor that was attached to the ship by a fraction of its designed structural capacity, and no one had known. After the disaster, Nordstrom and Thulin, who had been in the process of acquiring the Diana II as a second vessel for their Tallinn to Stockholm service, commissioned an independent inspection of the Diana II's bow visor by Turbo Technic of Wilhelmshaven. What the inspectors found was chilling. The Atlantic lock bolt had 35 millimeters of play, varying from lug to lug, where there should have been almost none. The lugs were oval. The bushings were oval. All 3 Atlantic lock lugs had been re-welded to the forepeak deck, the repairs from January 1993 still visible. The starboard side lock lug was not original. Turbo Technic delivered their verdict in a single damning line, concluding that on the whole the vessel could not be considered safe to operate in this condition. The sister ship, repaired after her own near failure, was still unsafe. The repairs that had been signed off by the surveyor and approved by the safety board had not restored the visor to a condition that an independent engineer considered seaworthy. The wreck of the Estonia was designated a protected burial site by an agreement signed by Sweden, Finland, and Estonia in 1995. Diving at the site was made illegal under the laws of all 3 nations. Initial plans to encase the wreck in concrete were proposed and then abandoned after protests from the families of the dead, who objected both to the disturbance and to the permanent sealing of a site that might yet yield answers to questions the official report had left unresolved. The ship remains where she settled, at a depth of 74 to 85 meters, resting on her starboard side, a sealed grave in the international waters of the Baltic. The dead lie inside her still, in the cabins where they were trapped, in the corridors they could not climb, in the stairwells that became vertical as the ship rolled over and took them down. The agreement declared that they would not be disturbed. The Baltic keeps the promise. In 2020, the story reopened. A Swedish documentary by journalist Henrik Evertsson revealed underwater footage of the wreck, showing a previously undocumented hole approximately 4 meters wide in the Estonia's starboard hull below the waterline. The discovery was sensational. It prompted accusations of cover-up, theories of collision, and calls for a full re-investigation. The 3 governments responded by lifting the gravesite restrictions temporarily and launching a new joint investigation that ran from 2021 through 2024, with research dives examining the hull hole and the surrounding wreck structure. The investigation confirmed the official report's core finding: the bow visor failure caused the sinking. The hull hole was assessed as most likely caused by impact with the seabed during or after the sinking, consistent with the ship's fall to the bottom and her resting position on the starboard side. The investigation was formally closed, reaffirming the conclusion that had been reached in 1997. Conspiracy theories had persisted for decades: allegations of a collision with a submarine, claims of secret military cargo, suggestions of a deliberate sinking, but none had been supported by the forensic evidence. The bow visor had killed the Estonia, and the evidence for that conclusion had been written in the steel itself. The disaster forced a global re-evaluation of RO-RO ferry design. The International Maritime Organization introduced the Stockholm Agreement in 1996, mandating enhanced stability standards for RO-RO passenger ferries operating in European waters, specifically addressing the survivability of water ingress on vehicle decks. Stronger bow doors and visors were required. Inner doors were mandated to be independently watertight. Water ingress detection systems were improved. The bow visor design that the Estonia had carried, in which the visor served as the primary weather barrier with the ramp behind it as the watertight boundary, was effectively phased out of new construction in favor of more robust, integrated bow door systems. The lessons were written into regulation. 852 people had paid for them with their lives. The new rules ensured that the bow visor design that had killed the Estonia would never kill again. But the regulations came after the disaster, and the knowledge that could have prevented it had existed before. The question was never whether the danger was known. The question was why the knowledge had stayed in the files and never reached the ships. Chapter 14. The warning that never arrived. The Estonia did not sink because of one bad storm or one unlucky wave. She sank because a system designed to learn from failure had failed to learn, and because the architecture of maritime safety in the early 1990s was a system of disconnected lessons that could not reach the people who needed them. She sank into a gap between what engineers knew and what the system did about it. A gap that was measured in filing cabinets and telephone calls that were never made, and circulars that were never sent, and inspections that were never ordered. The deeper truth was about the architecture of catastrophe itself, the way that large systems can know something at one point and remain ignorant of it at every other, the way that a lesson can be learned and simultaneously lost. The vulnerability was known. The 1974 report had said it plainly. Nearly all locking devices on existing vessels were too weak. The Herald of Free Enterprise had shown in 1987 that an open bow on a ro-ro ferry meant catastrophe when the sea got in. The Diana II had demonstrated in January 1993 that this specific visor design, built by this specific yard, on this specific class of ship, could and did fail under Baltic storm conditions that were entirely routine. Every piece of evidence needed to prevent the loss of the MS Estonia existed before the Estonia sailed on her final voyage. The evidence was there. The knowledge was there. The lesson was there. But maritime safety in the early 1990s was a system of vertical files, not horizontal connections. Classification societies inspected vessels individually, checking each ship against its own survey record, and did not systematically cross-reference failures across sister ships, across design families, across the fleet of vessels sharing the same bow visor attachment system from the same yard. Flag state inspections were often cursory, focused on visible defects and operational compliance, rather than on the deep structural condition of hidden welds and internal connections that could only be assessed by the kind of non-destructive testing that was never part of the routine survey. Information about near misses, about the Diana II's broken visor, about the 35 millimeters of play in her Atlantic lock, flowed upward from the surveyor's report to a file in an office and stopped. It did not flow sideways to the owners of the Estonia. to the crew of the Estonia, to anyone who might have looked at the Diana II's damage report and thought, the same Visor, built by the same yard, to the same drawings, and if it broke on her, it could break on the ship that carries 1,000 people across the same sea twice a week. The fatal flaw was the assumption that a structure which has not yet failed is a structure which is sound. It was the gap between what the forensic record showed, 90% cracked welds, a stempost in 4 pieces, hinge fillet welds that had failed long before the final night, and what the inspection regime was designed to find. Routine surveys checked that the visor opened, closed, and locked. The indicator lights showed green. The visor functioned. And because it functioned, it was certified as seaworthy, and because it was certified, 989 people boarded a ship whose bow was held together by the last few % of its original structural capacity, and sailed into a storm that the visor, in its proper condition, would have weathered without incident. The wreck of the MS Estonia lies today at approximately 59 degrees, 23 minutes north, 21 degrees, 42 minutes east, in the international waters between Estonia, Finland, and Sweden, 22 nautical miles from the Finnish island of Uto. She rests at a depth of 74 to 85 meters on her starboard side, on soft clay over stiff boulder clay. She is in relatively stable condition. She is a grave for 852 people whose families were told by the official agreement of 3 nations that the wreck would not be disturbed, that the dead would rest where they lay, that the Baltic would be their memorial. The currents move across her hull. The sediment gathers on her decks. The sea that killed her keeps her, and the darkness of the Baltic floor holds the dead in a silence that no inquiry, no documentary, no regulation has disturbed. The visor that killed her lies on the seabed nearby, 65.5 tons of steel that fell from the bow and sank in the same water, resting in the sediment a short distance from the ship it once protected. It was the weather cover that was supposed to keep the sea out, the clamshell of steel that had opened and closed thousands of times in 14 years of Baltic service. And it rests now in the same darkness as the ship, a monument to the assumption that what has always held will always hold. Kent Harstedt had his dinner in Stockholm with Sara Hedrenius, the stranger he met on a dying ship and kept alive through a freezing Baltic night by telling jokes and making promises he intended to keep. They both lived full lives. He became a member of parliament. She became a voice for resilience and survival. They carry what happened that night in a way that no report or regulation or international agreement can contain, the private weight of having survived something that 852 others did not, of having held a stranger's hand in 4-degree water while bodies bumped against their legs, of having told jokes in the dark to stay alive. The MS Estonia sailed from Tallinn on a September evening into an autumn storm that was unremarkable. Her bow visor had been failing for years, in the dark, in the welds, in the cracks that no one looked for because the visor still opened and closed and locked. And 20 months before she sailed, a near-identical visor on a near-identical ship had failed on the same sea, and the warning had been given, clearly and precisely, in a logbook and a surveyor's report and a telephone call to a safety board, and none of it had reached the Estonia's crew. The warning had already been given. It had simply never arrived. If the great maritime disasters stay with you, the way the Estonia stays with the Baltic, subscribe and join me for the next voyage. And tell me in the comments, if you had been aboard that night, do you think you could have made it to the outer deck?